It was a quiet Sunday in Memphis, mid-1970s. The choir had just started How Great Thou Art when a tall man in a white suit walked in. Heads turned, voices trembled. Some say it took a few seconds before people realized the man sliding into the back pew was Elvis Presley. Before we go on, make sure you stick with me until the end. What Elvis did after the final note. It's something that people in that church still talk about nearly 50 years later. The wooden doors swung wide on their heavy hinges, cutting through the middle of the hymn. A sudden shaft of gold light spilled across the red carpeted aisle. Dust motes hung in it, drifting slowly as if time itself had paused from the choir loft. The pastor could see him first, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a quiet ease. The white suit caught every glint of sunlight. His dark hair was perfectly set, sideburns sharp, and he was alone. No bodyguards, no photographers, just Elvis. Walking toward the back pew of a small red brick Baptist church on the edge of Memphis. The scent in the room was familiar. Lemon oil polish from the pews, faint perfume from the women's Sunday hats, the paper of worn hymnals. Outside, cicadas hummed against the August heat. Inside, the choir sang on, though eyes began to drift toward the unexpected visitor. Halfway down the row of altos, a silver-haired woman's hands slipped her sheet music fluttered to the floor. A boy in the third pew leaned close to his mother. "Mama, that's Elvis," he whispered, barely audible under the organ's swell. She pressed a finger to her lips, not to hush him, but because she was just as startled. The pastor, mid-verse, missed a beat before recovering. He had seen Elvis a few times at benefit concerts, but never here. Never like this. Elvis slid into the far end of the pew, nodding politely to a man who looked too stunned to move over right away. He folded his long frame down into the seat. Resting his large hands on his knees, the music continued. Some sang stronger, maybe to impress him. Others softened, afraid to break the spell. Then something subtle happened. During the second verse, Elvis's head lifted slightly. His lips moved. At first, it seemed like he was just mouthing along, but then he stood. No hurry, no drama, just a deliberate rising to his feet, straightening his jacket. In that small sanctuary, with the choir still holding the last note of the verse, it was the kind of movement that made people sit taller, lean forward. What was he about to do? Walk out? Speak? The sopranos faltered for half a beat as his gaze drifted toward the front dot, and then, without taking a single step forward, he opened his mouth to sing. The first note rolled out low and warm, not loud, but so full it seemed to vibrate through the pews. It was that unmistakable Elvis timbre, the kind that could pull a crowd of thousands to their feet. Now filling a room of barely 100 dot heads turned as if on cue. The altos in the second row forgot their harmony, eyes locked on the back. The bass section actually missed a measure, thrown off by the richness of the sound. From the loft, the organist's hands hovered over the keys for a split second. Later, she would say, "I felt chills, like the spirit moved through the pipes." The wooden pews creaked softly as people shifted, trying to get a better look without seeming rude. Somewhere near the middle, a man in a brown suit mouthed, "That's really him." Elvis didn't just sing the melody. He was weaving through every harmony line like he'd rehearsed with this choir for weeks. Each chord landed exactly where it should, his voice lifting in unison with the sopranos before dropping to lock with the basses. And yet, there was no showmanship, no big gestures, just a man in a white suit, head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, as though this was between him and the song alone. The scent of his aftershave drifted faintly toward the front. A fresh, clean note in the still air, carried forward each time he drew a deep breath. The congregation leaned into the sound. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Midway through the hymn, he opened his eyes. Something changed. He glanced toward the front, then toward the choir loft. A few in the first rows saw it, the slight narrowing of his gaze, the almost imperceptible smile. It was as if he'd decided something in that moment. Without missing a note, Elvis stepped sideways into the aisle. The sound of his shoes against the carpet was barely audible over the organ, but the sight was enough to send a ripple through the room. He didn't rush. Each step forward kept perfect time with the music. The pastor's eyes followed him, not quite sure what was about to happen. When he reached the front pew, he didn't turn toward the pulpit. Instead, he took the narrow side steps leading up. Toward the choir loft, the bass singers shifted instinctively, making space before he even asked. One of the tenors whispered, "He's coming up here," as if saying it too loudly might scare the moment away. The final chord of the hymn rang out, the last note held in the air like suspended breath. Elvis reached the loft. He rested his hand on the railing, scanning the choir with an almost boyish grin, and then he leaned toward the director and, in a quiet, almost shy tone, said, "Mind if I join you?" The choir director, a woman in her 50s, with a blue scarf tied neatly at her neck, blinked, as if making sure she'd heard him right. "Of course," she said softly, stepping back. Elvis climbed the last 2 steps into the loft. The old wood groaned under his weight, a sound the microphones would have picked up if there had been any. His leather shoes left faint, dark impressions on the worn varnish. The tenors shuffled, giving him space between a tall young man in a navy blazer and an older gentleman with a deep, gravelly bass. Both looked like they were trying not to stare. Elvis nodded in thanks, his eyes scanning the semicircle of singers. Then he reached for the nearest bass hymnal, the cover frayed, corners bent. Witnesses later swore he didn't even glance. At the lyrics, he stood easy, shoulders loose, one hand resting on the railing as the director raised her arm for the next hymn. Nervous laughter rippled through the altos, but it melted into smiles as they realized he was there to sing, not to steal the spotlight. The organ swelled, filling the loft with that familiar, warm tremor of air through pipes. From his place, Elvis glanced toward the congregation. The sight was electric, pews packed, people leaning forward, kids half standing to get a look. One older man removed his hat and held it in front of him as if the moment required it. Elvis's baritone threaded perfectly into the bass line, steady and sure. The young man beside him snuck a quick sideways glance, eyes wide. The older bass, on his other side, closed his own eyes, harmonizing as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Halfway through, something shifted. Elvis's voice dipped lower, then swelled upward with the tenors on a passing harmony, lifting the entire section's tone. The director caught his eye and gave a small, approving nod. It was a subtle thing, no showmanship, no spotlight, but you could feel the room's energy shift upward. Brighter, fuller dot then, as the hymn ended, the applause came. It wasn't the polite, scattered kind you sometimes hear in church. It rolled through the sanctuary like a wave, people clapping before the last note had even faded. Elvis smiled, dipping his head slightly, but kept his place in the loft. The director stepped forward, raising both hands for quiet. "We've been blessed this morning," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her own surprise. "And I think we have time for one more." She turned to Elvis. "Would you care to choose it?" He leaned close, his voice low so only she could hear. A few altos craned their necks, trying to read her lips. They saw her expression change, eyebrows lifting, mouth curving into a smile. "All right," she said, nodding to the organist. "We'll do that one." The congregation waited, a murmur running through the pews. Whatever he'd chosen, it was about to happen. The organist's hands hovered over the keys, and then the first slow, rolling chord filled the air. The first chord was deep, warm, like a heartbeat through the floorboards. The organist's left foot pressed the pedal, letting the note hang dot. Then the melody began. "Peace in the Valley." It was a song Elvis had first recorded for charity, back in 1957. Some in the congregation had been young adults then. They remembered the black and white television broadcast. They remembered the quiet dignity with which he'd sung it for millions. Now, here he was, no cameras, no stage lights, only the soft glow of stained glass spilling reds, golds, and blues across his white suit. Elvis's voice was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he was feeling the room before letting the weight of the song settle in. "I'm tired and so weary." The sopranos tilted forward slightly, harmonizing under their breath until their cue came. The altos' eyes glistened. They knew this hymn well. The air in the loft smelled faintly of old varnish and pressed fabric. Down in the pews, you could hear the faint creak of someone leaning against the wooden backrest, not wanting to miss a single note. By the second verse, his voice had grown stronger, richer, the kind of tone that could fill an arena, but here felt intimate, like it was meant only for the people in this room. The older man in the front row took off his glasses, wiping them with his handkerchief, even though they were already clean. The organ swelled under him, but never overpowered. "He will lead me." A tear rolled down the cheek of a soprano too. Places to his right. She didn't wipe it away. The congregation began to hum softly. It wasn't planned. It just happened. A gentle undercurrent of voices rose up to meet him, like the tide reaching for the shore. Elvis closed his eyes on the final chorus. One hand gripped the railing of the loft, knuckles pale. He sang as though the words belonged to him alone in that moment. No audience, no fame, no past, and the night is as fair as the day. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was almost heavier than the music. No one moved. The only sound was the soft hiss of air through the organ pipes as the organist's foot lifted from the pedal. Then the room erupted, not in a cheer, but in a flood of applause, hands clapping in unison, punctuated by the occasional amen from the back. Elvis didn't bow. He simply looked out over the congregation, lips curving into a modest smile, and then, something unexpected, he stepped down from the loft, slowly, deliberately, as if he knew the moment wasn't over. The applause softened to a murmur as people watched him descend the narrow wooden stairs to the sanctuary floor. From there, he walked along the side aisle toward the very front pew. His gaze was fixed, not on the pastor, not on the choir director, but on a small boy seated at the end of the row. The boy had been quiet the whole service, his hands resting in his lap. Now he looked up, wide-eyed, as Elvis stopped in front of him. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear this boy was the reason Elvis had come down. The boy was no more than 10. Brown hair, neatly combed, white shirt buttoned all the way up, despite the August heat pressing through the open windows. In his lap, a piece of cardboard hand-cut, edges uneven, with 4 words written in blocky black marker: "Sing for my grandpa in heaven." Elvis knelt so they were eye level. The movement alone drew the breath from the room. His knees touched the carpet, the white of his suit brushing the edge of the pew. The scent of women's perfume lingered in the air, mixed with the faint tints of hot dust from the old ceiling. "Fans, is that for me?" Elvis asked, nodding toward the sign. The boy swallowed hard, but couldn't make his voice work. He just nodded. Elvis smiled softly. Without breaking eye contact, he reached up and pulled the silk scarf from around his neck, pale blue, embroidered at the ends. He took the boy's small hands in his own, wrapping the scarf gently around them. The fabric slid easily over the boy's skin, cool from the church's shade. "It's yours now," Elvis said quietly. The congregation was completely silent. No rustle of hymnals, no shifting in the pews. Even the cicadas outside seemed to have stopped. Then Elvis began to hum. It was just one verse, sung so low the people in the back had to lean forward to catch it. His voice was warm, steady, the kind of sound that carries more comfort than volume ever could. The boy's lower lip trembled. His eyes, already bright, filled until the image of Elvis blurred in front of him. A woman in the second pew dabbed at her own tears, unable to look away. The pastor, hands clasped in front of him, bowed his head. When the short verse ended, Elvis gave the boy's hands a final squeeze before letting go. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. His expression said everything, a mix of awe, grief, and something like peace. Elvis straightened, stepping back just enough to glance toward the choir loft again. He gave a small wave to the director, then turned back. To the boy with a wink. The service moved on, at least it tried to. People would later say the rest of the hymns felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. But this story wasn't done, because a week later, at a modest home on the outskirts of Memphis, a postal carrier would step onto a front porch with a brown parcel tucked under his arm inside the house. The same boy from that pew would hear the knock, and what he found on the other side of that door would stay with him for the rest of his life. The brown parcel was plain, no logos, no decorative stamps, only a Memphis postmark and the boy's name written in neat, careful script. His mother turned it over in her hands. "No return address," she said, puzzled. The cardboard gave off the faint, woody smell of a storage room, like it had been waiting somewhere for years. The boy tore at the tape, the flaps opening with a low rip. Inside was a black, velvet-lined guitar case. The cedar scent rushed out as he unlatched it. He lifted the lid. Inside lay a small acoustic guitar. The wood was warm amber, smooth to the touch, the strings new and tight. Tucked under the neck, folded in half, was a piece of ivory stationery. He opened it carefully. The handwriting slanted slightly to the right. Bold but unpretentious. "You'll always have a seat in the front row." Elvis the boy read it twice, then a third time, as if to be certain. His hands shook as he held the guitar, the silk scarf from that Sunday still wrapped loosely around his wrist. His mother covered her mouth with her hand. She knew what that moment meant, not just for the boy, but for the memory of the grandfather, whose absence had inspired that cardboard sign. According to a neighbor who saw the package arrive, the boy took the guitar to his room and played it every day, even before he knew more than 2 chords. Years later, he would tell a local reporter that the guitar never left his possession. By then, He was a man leading music in his own church, still wearing that scarf on special occasions. The notes stayed folded in the case, its edges yellowing with time, but the ink never fading. For him, it wasn't about owning something from Elvis Presley. It was about what it stood for, that in a room full of people, the king of rock and roll had seen him, heard him, and given him a moment to hold on to forever. Sometimes the most powerful stage is the one without spotlights. Members of that congregation still tell the story. Some say it was the most moving service they ever attended. The church itself kept a framed photo of that Sunday in its foyer. For decades, Elvis standing in the loft, head tilted back in song. The boy, now older, still plays that guitar. The scarf hangs in a shadow box on his wall, next to a small cardboard sign with 4 words in faded black marker. If this moved you, share it with someone who believes. Kindness can stop a room. And tell me, what's the most unforgettable act of kindness you've ever witnessed?